Record. All right. Whew, my goodness. Technology that brings us together does make it more challenging. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Barb Cardell. I'm the training director with PWN USA, and I am very excited to be able to bring you our PWN Votes by Mail We Will Be Counted webinar. Just a little bit of logistics before we dive in. This meeting is being recorded and we are trying to stream it live on Facebook. So if you ask a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand. Everyone is in mute mode or attendee mode, which is our webinar setting. And so we will go ahead and take you off of mute so you can go ahead and ask a question. Or as always, you can ask questions in the question and answer box, and we will have time for question and discussion at the end of the webinar as well. Our presenters today, we have Barb Cardell. I use they, them, their pronouns. And as I mentioned, I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Director. Ebony, do you mind coming off of mute and introducing yourself?
Hi everybody, I'm Ebony Turk. I am the National Field Organizer and I use she and her pronouns. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Brianna, do you mind introducing yourself next?
Yeah, no problem. Hey everyone, my name is Brianna Diaz. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Policy Director for PWN.
Great, and Nana.
Hey everyone, Nana Khanna, she, her, Executive Director of Positive Women's Network.
Wonderful, thank you. And as we asked, if people are willing to put their names, if they're with an organization and their pronouns in the chat box, that would be great. Then we have an idea about who is with us today, where you're located, and yes, indeed, what your pronouns are. So our objectives today are going to be to understand how voting by mail can expand access to voting. We'll talk a little bit about why voting is so important. Okay, that wasn't me.
It shows it's still recording. I don't understand.
Yeah, it shows it's still recording. So, all right, we'll keep an eye on that. Sorry, Zoom is not helping us today. So our objectives are that we're going to understand how voting by mail can expand our access to voting. We're going to talk about challenges and opportunities, especially as we work to improve voting by mail. We're going to talk about implementing a vote by mail drive. We'll even have a few tips and tricks from people who are in Pennsylvania who have been working on a vote by mail drive. And we'll talk a little bit about advocacy that happened in Georgia as well. And finally, as always, you know, we're PWN, so we have a call to action and a way we're hoping that you will be able to be engaged and help us with this most important drive. So we're going to do, we did our welcome and our introduction. We'll talk about why voting by mail is so important. We'll talk about how vote by mail landscape shifts our political systems. We'll talk about the state of play, opportunities and challenges. And then finally, we'll have some case studies about how did vote by mail go in Georgia and the Pennsylvania primaries. And then we'll wrap up with what you can do. With that, I'll turn it over to Ebony.
Thanks, Barb. So a little bit about Positive Women's Network USA. We're a national organization of women in the US that is led by women living with HIV, and by women, for women, and women of trans experience. Our mission is always to prepare and involve women living with HIV in all of our diversity in all levels of policy and decision making. We have chapters in Colorado, Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and New York. And we have chapters, I'm sorry, we have state leads, state leaders in Oregon, Nevada, Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, and Ohio. If anyone is interested in being involved with our chapters are a group of women living with HIV who plan for local, state, national. They do local, state, and national advocacy in their states, their cities. Our state leaders, they work with different groups of people. They work with allies. They work on coalitions. They work with policy groups to help advance policies that are good for women living with HIV in their state. If you are interested in joining any one of those chapters or want to work with any of those state leaders, feel free to reach out and let us know, and we'll get you connected. Thanks, Barb.
Great, thank you, Ebony. Next we'll go to Nana. And Nana, I think you've got control of this.
Okay, great. I don't have control, so I'll just say next slide. Thank you. So next slide, please. Okay, great. So we know that folks are probably not confused about why this election is important. All elections are important, from state to local to federal. And we know that there's especially a lot at stake this year. Our very human rights are on the line. The dignity and humanity of our communities is on the line. Democracy is on the line. You know, there is a lot at stake. And we're actively in election season. So many of the primaries, as folks know, and runoff elections have had their dates moved because of everything happening with the coronavirus pandemic. We know that also there's been a lot of shenanigans around new kinds of attempts at vote suppression, even in light of this primary season and this runoff season. And so Positive Women's Network is 100% committed to making sure that our community is prepared and informed to show up at the polls, to understand what is at stake on their ballots, and to participate in every possible way that reduces barriers to voting, to make sure that we can advance our vision for justice for our communities. And that means racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, protecting trans rights, safety, and dignity, ending criminalization and the carceral state that we know is impacting our communities, ending anti-Black racism, compassionate policies for immigrants, and universal health care for all of us, among other things. Next slide, please. And we know that when our communities show up, we can win. And we have had, we've had lots of progress in terms of even recently, while the last couple of years have felt a little bit bleak, there have been election results that have helped to move a broad progressive policy agenda. And so if folks are paying attention to the news right now, I know there's a lot of attention to issues around defending Black lives, defunding police, for example. So just a couple of examples. Those folks who are voting on police budgets right now, on whether to use tear gas against protesters, on what types of military tactics cops will be allowed to use in their communities, those are people who were elected at the local level, usually at city council level or a board of supervisors level. Or a school board level. Also determining whether cops are in our schools and whether they're armed in our schools, and what kinds of other alternatives to policing and criminalization might be available for our communities. So these are elections, like city council elections, school board races, and other things that often are overlooked when we talk about the electoral landscape, but are deeply consequential. And these are also elections that where a handful of votes, you know, a few hundred votes really can make a big difference. And we know that our community is powerful. Our community is well connected, well resourced. We have been, the HIV community has been building power for a very long time at the local level that can be leveraged into electoral power. And that means not just who gets elected, but what are the priorities of the people who get elected? And what do they know and understand about your issues? What commitments have they made on our issues before they get into office, right? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we also know that elections often swing by just a handful of votes. There are more than 1 million people living with HIV in the US, and there are millions more folks connected to some part of the HIV service delivery infrastructure. So whether you're talking about, you know, an STI clinic or a Planned Parenthood, an HIV service delivery organization, a support group, an ASO, an AIDS service organization in your community, there are lots of potential voters, actual voters and potential voters coming through the doors. Even if the doors today are kind of metaphysical, right? Because of COVID and because of telehealth and things like that, there are many folks that people are interacting with that we can reach. When you look at the history of some major elections, we can see that even small numbers of votes have had consequences as far up as the presidential level. So in the year 2000, folks might remember that that presidential election literally came down to 537 votes in Florida that decided the, you know, the presidential election and the next 2 terms. So the next 8 years of who was leading the presidency. In 2016, the national presidential election really came down to less than 80,000 votes in 3 major states when you look at the actual map, because we have a really, we have this terrible system called the Electoral College where not every vote is equally important when it comes to the presidency. And so, so really it's important to understand that small steps that we take can have a big impact and be a big consequence. Next slide, please. But we know there are tons of barriers to voting, and those are only increasing. And so, you know, there have been long lines at polling stations. There have been attempts to integrate things like social distancing, which is great, but also means the lines can be even longer at the polls. We have always already had a problem with long lines at polling places. That is not new. It is just getting worse. And as we'll hear from our folks in Pennsylvania and Georgia later, COVID has just added a whole new dimension in terms of a number of polling places being closed, lines being even longer than usual. So basically the system is set up to make it really hard for people to vote. And by the way, this is not normal. It's not the way that things have to be. You know, there are countries where voting is mandatory, or it's mandatory to at least like submit something that says, I choose not to vote. Or there are countries where election day is a national holiday. There are places where people are just like automatically registered to vote. Here in the US, we have historically created as many obstacles as possible for people to participate in the electoral process. And those take many different forms, from felon disenfranchisement laws to you know, basically like a poll tax if you have to pay for stamps on your ballot, or if you have to vacate some kind of fines you had before you can actually vote. We make it as hard as possible, and that is not an accident, that is intentional, and it is designed to protect the interests of a few people in power who are really afraid of losing power. When our folks show up, when Black and brown folks show up at the polls, when low-income folks show up at the polls, when people living with disabilities, living with HIV, people who really understand and live at the intersection of lots of different forms of social marginalization and oppression, when we show up to vote, things will look really different. And so these are intentional strategies that are being used, and these are the strategies that we are trying to combat by looking at alternatives. Next slide, please. So also, COVID has also presented a lot of complications. So it's much harder to register voters now. Normally in a presidential year, massive voter registration efforts are underway. People are going door to door. Folks are going into, are going to community events, registering voters. Well, we all know that hasn't been happening because we need to take care of ourselves and our people. And so there's actually a decline in voter registration in states like Florida, which we know is going to be pivotal to the election. And by the way, where over 1 million people with a history of felony conviction had their rights restored. This time around, it's going to be harder for them to vote, even though their rights have been restored. So COVID has presented a whole new set of complications and barriers around the elections this time. Next slide, please. So that's all to say, it's really time for us to all go all in. It's all hands on deck time for us to be involved, make sure that our communities have the information they need to be prepared to show up, that we do our part to reduce any possible barriers to voting, that folks understand their options, that we advocate to dismantle all these institutional and systemic barriers. There's still time. There's still a lot of time between now and November. Things are changing and they're changing fast. And so we still have the opportunity to engage a lot more people. We still have the opportunity to actually change the systems and change, little things like what the hours are that people can go and vote, or how they will turn in their mail-in ballots and things like that. And we're going to get into the details of that later. Next slide, please. So just a couple of quick definitions. What are we talking about when we say vote by mail? This means a lot of things. And every state is really different and really complicated. And so we're not going to be able to go into the nitty-gritty details of every state today, but basically what we're talking about when we talk about vote by mail is like a way for voters to cast their ballots without going in person to a polling place. That's, in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about. Is there a way for people to participate in the electoral process without having to show up? And how easy is it for them to take advantage of that option? So usually in most locations where vote by mail is available, it doesn't usually replace in-person voting. I say usually because there are a couple states that are all vote by mail. Colorado is one of them, and Oregon is another one of them. But in most places, vote by mail is an option on top of other options. Every state literally has different laws on who can vote by mail, how you vote by mail, and then even some counties have their own laws. So what we're going to do today is sort of lay out a framework for common things that are going on, look at some trends and things like that, and then invite you to do some more deep diving on what's going on in your own home state and county that you can get involved in. Also, laws for November 2020 in some places are literally in flux. There is one party that is throwing up a lot of legal and other types of challenges to vote by mail expansion. Pretty hard to guess who that might be. There's another party that is working pretty hard to expand vote by mail. So there have been days recently where the decisions were coming out, hour by hour, like in Texas, for example. There was an attempt to expand vote by mail. A court challenged that decision later that same day. Somebody else came back and challenged the court's decision literally that day as well. So this is all very much still in flux, and there are some states and counties where we can expect this to be more stable than others, but there are also a lot of unknowns, which I know makes it a little harder to plan, but also gives us a lot of room to advocate to make things better. Next slide, please. So why would we be pushing for vote by mail? Well, historically, states that make it easier to vote by mail have higher voter turnout. And we just saw that, for example, as recently as in Iowa, where new vote by mail proceedings were set up, they had the highest turnout ever, I think, in a primary that they've had. So, promptly, after seeing the results of those primary elections, there were some challenges presented saying, we can't have this go on for the general election. You know, we don't want that many people to be voting, basically. But there is higher voter turnout when we have vote by mail available. It's safer for our folks. People should not have to choose between exercising their civic right to vote and their health. Folks shouldn't have to be able to shouldn't be forced to expose themselves to a virus in order to participate in this electoral system. I mean, that is just so ridiculous that we even have to say that, right? But that's the choice that a lot of voters are being basically forced to make in a number of states. As I said, there are often long lines at polling places. With COVID and with many polling places being closed, the lines are even longer. That is quite inaccessible for voters who may have mobility challenges. It may be hard to stand up for a long time. You know, there's not always like water and snacks. Like maybe you have to get to work and you can't be in line for a million hours. Maybe you have to pick up your kids and you can't be in line for a million hours. You know, there are lots of reasons that long lines are a deterrent to participating in the electoral process. Also, when you get your ballot in the mail, it's a lot easier to do your homework and kind of research what's on your ballot. And so we also see that in states that have vote by mail, there's more of a tendency to vote all the way down the ballot to participate in down ballot races, because a lot of times folks walk into the polling place on election day and they know a couple of the candidates at the top of the ticket, but they've never heard the names of some of the ones below. And often it's very confusing to even figure out what are these different positions that we're voting on. What's the difference between like what the county judge does and what the appellate judge does? And how do I know who these people are, right? So getting your ballot in the mail, usually it comes a few weeks ahead of time. That gives you some time to like do some homework, do some research, talk to your family, talk to your friends, look at other, information from other organizations that you know and trust in your community, of what they're saying about these candidates. And then of course, transportation to polling places is always a barrier. We frequently in the HIV community talk about transportation as a big barrier to participation in healthcare. Well, if it's hard for folks to get to a medical appointment or to fill their prescription, how do you expect them to get to a polling place? They may not have bus fare. They may not feel well enough to go to the polling place that day. It can be really difficult. So ultimately, polling shows that people in the US want the option to be able to vote by mail. They may or may not choose to do it, but they want the option to do it. Next slide, please. So just this week, I was talking about how things are in flux. Just this week, we've had some developments. So I am sharing this, not to really get into the specifics of any particular states, but more to show you that this is very much a live conversation. Things are happening right now. Like Illinois just signed a bill to expand vote by mail. New Jersey County is having everybody vote by mail in their primary. Like Texas is still trying to figure out what it's going to do about vote by mail, right? And they have a runoff election coming up in just a few weeks, and it's still not totally clear what the expansion process will be around vote by mail. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, cool. So again, we're not going to go into the details of every state, but this is just to give you a little bit of a glimpse. There are different kinds of vote by mail available, and different states have very different policies around this. So you can see that in all the states that are in red here, there is an absentee voting process, but you have to have some sort of excuse. And there are different criteria for what those excuses are in the different states. The place to get information about that is on your Secretary of State's website to find out exactly what the guidance is. In the states that are in blue here, there is both vote by mail and there's something called no excuse absentee voting, which means that you can vote You can vote by mail. You can vote without being there physically in person, without having to tell them why. So examples of things that are sometimes considered, criteria for an excuse for absentee voting are like being sick, being out of town, being in active military service, being in some places there's an age requirement. Like if you're 65 or over, you can qualify for an absentee ballot. What we're really trying to get to is a place where folks don't have to have a reason. They can just say, we want to vote by mail. And Brianna's going to talk about that in much more detail later. So the states that are in gray here are the ones where you can vote what's called absentee, not being there, without any excuse. Next slide, please. So as I said, we really are not going to be able to go through every single nuance of every county and state, but we're going to talk about just like general trends. We're going to go over some case studies, and we're going to talk about some strategies. Next slide. This is just at a glance, like, what is your state? Find your state. This is a quiz. Just kidding. We'll share these slides with you. We don't expect you to read all this, but you can see that there are a handful of states that are universal vote by mail, where everybody votes by mail. And then there are a bunch of states where there are different kinds of criteria required. Next slide, please. So I think this is my last slide. So just kind of explaining a little bit more what you were looking at. So in some states where everything is vote by mail, that means how it works is ballots are automatically mailed to every eligible voter. In most states, that is not the case. In most states, what you have to do is, even if there is a vote by mail option or an absentee ballot option, you have to request that type of ballot. So California has been an example of one of those states where that's where I live. It's what I'm most familiar with. You can register to vote what's called permanent absentee, which means that every election you get mailed a ballot. You don't have to request it for every individual election, but you do have to request it one time. And so that's a law that has just changed to actually reduce barriers, but that's an example of sort of like a medium state. Again, this issue of whether you have to have an excuse or not an excuse to request an absentee ballot, it varies from state to state. The language to look for it, and they make it a little tricky, but it's like, what's a qualified voter to request a ballot? So like I was saying, in some states, it may be that if you're 65 or older, you can request an absentee ballot without any other reason. That's what they would consider a qualified voter. Or it might be if you're a registered voter. That's what it means to be a qualified voter. If you're a registered voter, you can request an absentee ballot without an excuse. Whereas in some states, you have to have an accepted excuse, and there's a list of things that are acceptable and there are a lot of things that are not on that list, right? So in some places that are requiring an excuse, this is just an example of a live conversation, it is contested whether COVID-19, risk of the fear of placing yourself at risk for COVID-19 would qualify as an acceptable excuse. And again, I share this because this is where there's a lot of room for advocacy. There's a lot of room for advocacy to define what a qualified voter would be. There's a lot of room to define what an acceptable excuse would be, in addition to some other things. And so I will turn the next set of slides over to Brianna.
Great. Thanks. So yeah, I'll start with the general truths about vote by mail. If y'all have ever seen that little acronym VBM, vote by mail. So in most places with VBM, voters have to actively request a vote by mail ballot. And as Nana said earlier, there are exceptions for that active request in Oregon and Colorado. In those two states, you will automatically receive one. Otherwise, if you have vote by mail as an option, you must act in requesting one. I know I am in Virginia. I'm a voter in Virginia. And when I was requesting my absentee ballot to vote by mail in an upcoming election here in Richmond, Virginia, I had to go to the government website, fill out this really fun form, and then I had to wait to receive my ballot. That information, that process was not actively sent to me. I had to act. There is a deadline to request vote by mail ballots, and that will vary state by state. I know in the chat box, we provided a resource for you to check in with your Secretary of State, or other resources that can tell you what your state's deadline are. But if you are having trouble, I know us at PWN are happy to help you figure out what your state's deadline is to request a ballot. So vote by mail ballots are mailed several weeks before the election, unless I guess you live in Georgia. And so typically this means people start voting several weeks before the election. For example, in California, usually more than 60% of voters have voted before the polls open on election day. So if you just want to get your voting done with, and you can with a vote by mail ballot, this is a phenomenal way to cast your vote, other than the election day. And this also changes our get out the vote strategies dramatically, right? So like how we engage with our communities will differ if we're allowed to provide another opportunity to vote via vote by mail. It can expand the timeline under which our community can vote. And vote by mail is new for a lot of people, so education and outreach are required. I think this is a point to hammer on, also considering we're in the time of a pandemic, where a lot of the population will likely be shifting to vote by mail where it exists and is accessible for most folks. And this is a whole new way of engaging in a complicated, intentionally complicated system. Next. So I'm sure in the vote by mail discussion, you've heard a lot of concerns, but you've also heard a lot of rebuttals to those concerns, and we're going to outline some of them for y'all right now. You might have heard that vote by mail is new. It is not. It is absolutely not new. It has been around for a minute in many states. Below I write, roughly 25% of voters cast a mail ballot in the last 2 federal elections. 25% of voters, right? And another statistic is that mail balloting is the primary means of voting in Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah. And 28 additional states allow no excuse mail balloting. So this number of states have been participating in vote by mail prior to the pandemic. I think that shows that there are systems in place that have worked, systems in place that require a lot of improvement, pandemic aside, but these statistics are showing us that the narrative of vote by mail is new, therefore it might be a risk to voter integrity is already defeated. That argument is already defeated. And then one last stat, in 2018, more than 31 million Americans, or as I said, 25.8% of election participants cast their vote by mail. Another common critique or concern that we hear is fraud. Like, there are these real fraud concerns with vote by mail, but actually there's no evidence. Like there's no evidence that vote by mail leads to more fraud. So there was this one study that was conducted that from 2000 to 2012, only 491 cases of absentee ballot fraud out of the billions of votes cast between those 12 years were fraud. That's less than 0.0001%. It's infinitesimal. It's not significant enough of an epidemic to I think outweigh the value of utilization that vote by mail presents to our communities. That argument is just straight up defeated. Next. So I think whenever we're hearing people talk about their, voice their concerns of vote by mail as fraud, I think it's great for us to know the safeguards that have existed prior to vote by mail, expansion in light of the pandemic, and understand how they work, right? So there are ways to safeguard your absentee ballot and how you vote by mail. So one, there are barcodes. These barcodes that you receive with your absentee ballot typically on the envelope, they allow election officials to keep track of ballot processing and help voters know whether their ballots have been received. So I think the barcode is a response to the concern of, once I mail my ballot, how do I know it has reached its destination? You want to make sure that no one is interfering with your ballot across the entire mailing process, right? So this barcode allows for that monitoring of the delivery of your ballot through the process. It also allows states to identify and eliminate duplicate ballots if a voter casts more than one. Because a barcode will be matched to your name, your address, residency that is provided in voter records. If the USPS or if some other entity that's tracking the ballots notice that there's a duplicate, they can just pull that one. Mistakes happen and things will be fine. Another way that safeguard for a vote by mail is ballot tracking via the United States Postal Service. And what this does is that, again, barcodes linked to USPS enable voters and election officials to track an envelope from drop-off to delivery, as well as processing your actual ballot. So that's fun. Another safeguard is identity verification. And what that is that the mail ballot envelope itself might require a signature match. Like, so you sign it, and when you mail it, that signature could be matched with your voter roll signature to ensure that the person who submitted this vote by mail ballot, it's that same person that's in the voter roll. There are additional safeguards that we don't cover here, but I think another one worth mentioning is the punitive response for violating these fraud laws these voter laws are so high and so harsh that I think that is another, way that to divert people from committing fraud. Not that, we want like a punitive response to these things, like to the degree that they exist. It is worth noting that the response for voter fraud is so high, the punishment is so high that it just doesn't make sense to, participate in voter fraud. But next. So we know the current state of vote by mail. We know that there are safeguards for them, but vote by mail can honestly be improved. There's a lot of room for improvement, and we provided a couple up here. We think, as Nana has articulated, no excuse vote by mail options should exist. Again, I'm in Virginia. We just got that. I'm very excited to see how that plays out in future elections. And just as recent as the pandemic, our governor issued an executive order expanding one excuse under our VBM requirements to allow COVID-19 to be an excuse in order to receive your ballot. So that's great, but it shouldn't, your ability to participate shouldn't be based on where you live. We are hoping that no excuse vote by mail options will exist universally. Second, postage should be free and prepaid. I know across the states, this varies on whether you yourself have to pay the postal fee to mail your own ballot, and that in practice looks like a poll tax, right? Like, why are we paying to have access to our civic right and duty? So we support that, the notion that postage should be free or prepaid. Third, we want an increase in drop-off sites, and we want to see an increase in the timeline for vote by mail ballots to be cast. Depending on your state, there can be very strict requirements with where you are allowed to drop off your ballot to specific ballot boxes. And I know we saw in the case of Georgia recently, some of those boxes were locked, which kind of prevents you from casting your ballot. And we also want to make sure that the time to cast your ballot is extended, because life gets in the way. Sometimes the Postal Service or something can get in the way where maybe your ballot did not reach the destination in time required by law. And that should not be reason in and of itself for your vote to not count. So we should see an extension of when ballots will be accepted for elections. We also want to allow community organizations to help collect and deliver voted and sealed ballots. Again, the ballot box, access to where they are, Sometimes there are people who live in rural communities where postal service is not regular and is not very accountable. And so we want the community to be empowered to set up its own ballot collection and delivery service. And this exists in states already. 5, allow ballots to be submitted through election day. Again, extend the timeline for your ballot to count. And 6, no witness requirement for absentee voting. We'll go over this in the next slide a bit, but there are some states that require that a witness watch you cast your ballot, sign off on it, and return it. And we already know there's a lot of concerns around public health in a pandemic and also why. So we'll get into that later. And 7, reform signature matching laws to protect voters. Signature laws are a safeguard, but there is still a lot of, I think, accessibility. Like what happens if you did not update your voter roll signature? I know my signature has changed over time. So like that reason should not be the only reason for your ballot to get kicked from being counted. So there can definitely be reform efforts to update signature matching laws. Next. So this is a map on, I believe, point 6, I said, where room for improvement exists. And it's how to make vote by mail better within the authenticity, like the verification, witness signature, like requirement for some states with ballots. And so this is a map of the U.S. in a different shape, but you can see that there are a lot of states that compare signatures on your ballot and envelope with signature on file, but there are some states, 2 in particular, Alabama and Arkansas, that require a photocopy of your ID to be returned with your ballot. And in Alabama, you actually have to get a signature from a notary. So you have to find a notary to sign your ballot before you can send it in, or 2 witnesses. These witness requirements, Alabama's being, 1 to 2, where there are other states on this map that require, just 1. Those kind of fly in the face of public health, right? Like we're supposed to be socially socially distancing, so that kind of undermines that. And second, it's inconsistent with accessibility. So we're hoping that these states with this stringent requirement can be changed. Next. So I know we're talking about vote by mail, but we wanted to stress that even though it isn't everywhere, if you must vote in person during the pandemic, you have to take precautions. And so we just wanted to include this slide as a caveat to, vote by mail, that, if you are going to vote in person on election day or early voting, let's just be safe. Try to vote early if you can. Typically, early voting has fewer crowds and fewer lines, and you can follow COVID-19 safety procedures. And then voting on election day, try to vote at a time of the day when your precinct is less likely to be crowded. And again, follow COVID-19 safety procedures. Our hope is that we aren't like that in person is the only option for us, but if it is, let's just practice safety. Next. All right, so I'm going to go over some federal steps to expand vote by mail. Cool, so there are a couple federal responses in responding to the pandemic, right? And the first one was the CARES Act. I know we all might know it for, a stimulus check or other benefits, but it also included $400 million in new Help America Vote Act emergency funds. This $400 million was distributed by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or the EAC. And these $400 million that was distributed by the EAC to states and localities, specifically to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus for the 2020 federal election cycle. And so these funds can be used for things such as like making polling locations safe, like providing PPE and hiring temporary staff to staff polling locations. It also allows, the funding is allowed to be used for new administrative costs and burdens of switching to vote by mail, as well as hiring additional staff to run vote by mail. Next. So $400 million is not enough money to do this. Like, it's like $400 million is nowhere near the amount of money we need to see a efficient vote by mail system in America. And so most recently in this fourth care package that the House passed recently, the HEROES Act, there was an additional allocation of $3.6 billion for state and local governments to make their election systems safe for voters and poll workers under pandemic conditions. Right now, the HEROES Act, as I said, has passed the House. It's sitting in the Senate. The Senate has indicated that when it reconvenes at the end of July, it will pick up discussion of a fourth COVID-19 relief package. And so I think it's critical that we as advocates make our voice heard when the Senate picks up this issue and say, we want this 3.6 bill to make sure that our systems are adequately funded to run vote by mail. Next. And then the one last federal response, there actually was a bill introduced on March 18th of this year, and it's called the Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act. It was introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar and Senator Wyden. And what this bill would do, it would say voters have 20 days of early voting in all states. It would require all mail-in ballots submitted during the 21 days leading to an election be counted. And it also ensures that all voters have the option to request absentee ballots. Because this is a Senate side bill, and I think even if it was a House bill, this bill doesn't have a high likelihood of making it anywhere, just considering the rhetoric the Trump administration is pushing out with vote by mail and Republican hesitancy to address this issue at the federal level. But I still think it's worth highlighting this particular bill, that it is a topic of conversation amongst our members of Congress, and that there is interest, and we should continue to advocate for a better system. Next. And I'm done.
Yeah, and you're handing it over back to me. Just wanted to send a reminder, if you're putting questions or comments in the chat, if you can address them to both the panelists and the attendees, that would be great, because then everybody can sort of see what you're asking, and also can share in our collective wisdom that we have. So there should be just a select all panelists and attendees, unless there is a question that you want to ask offline. And we're also answering questions in the question and answer box as well. So I have the distinct honor to be able to talk about two case studies about where we have had PWN action on the ground and have been able to can share some lessons that we've learned. First up, we're going to go to Georgia, and I am going to ask LaTanya Roby. LaTanya, do you mind coming off of mute and introducing yourselves, and then telling us a little bit about what happened in Georgia, and certainly lessons that we want to learn from Georgia?
Absolutely, absolutely. My name is LaTanya Roby. We just had our election on June 9th. It was actually our postponed election, and it was scheduled for June 9th. It was myself and Joyce Hampton, one of the members of PWN, went to 9 different polling locations. And one of the things we did early on that morning was kind of listen to the news just to see if the polling stations were going to get off to a good start, and they did not. Immediately when polls were open, the lines were extremely long, and there was a lot of reports that polling locations, the doors weren't even open on time. And so once we realized that there were a lot of long lines, we decided, okay, we know this is going to be a long day. We had no idea how long and how bad it was at that point, but we decided to go out and get some water, snacks, mask, and hand sanitizer to make sure that we get to these different locations, just to give the people an opportunity to stay in line, whatever it took for us to kind of keep them in line to vote. Like I said, we went to 9 different polling locations. in different parts of 3 different counties, Gwinnett, Fulton, and DeKalb. And I mean, you could tell the different counties and who the constituents were in the different counties based on the preparedness of the polling stations. And the lines at just about all of the polling locations, except in some of the more affluent areas, were very long. It was nothing like I'd ever seen. And mind you, on that day, it was extremely hot. There was a downpour for a while, so it rained, and people stayed in line. In my opinion, there is no reason. Georgia is a absentee, no excuse ballot state. However, I won't say the vast majority, a substantial amount of people never received their requested absentee ballots. And it was a big problem because they were forced to go into the polls at the last minute, stand in the long lines. We had situations where we did a few interviews and actually posted them to Facebook, but we had situations where people were told if the polling station closed at 7 o'clock, even though the line was still long, they would lock the door and tell them to go somewhere else. And they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to go to the last person in line, give them some type of indicator that they are the last person in line, take everyone up to that person, and then close the doors. They were literally locking the doors and telling them to go somewhere else. In some cases, they were, there was a group that actually got the police called on them because they would not get out of line. They knew what the rules were and they wouldn't get out of line. They called the police on them. We spoke with one young lady who had there was 3 carloads of younger voters who were voting for the first time who was following her to 3 different polling locations because they kept getting kicked off from the last polling location. And those, carloads of young voters just stopped. They didn't even go to the last place where we ended up interviewing her. So it was a very bad situation. I think that one of the things that we absolutely need to do is to push absentee ballots. In Georgia, you have till the 13th to register, so we're kind of up against the clock. You have to register to vote by the 13th, and then they don't send out the absentee ballots for the general election. They can't start sending them out until 180 days out. And so there's a lot of work that needs to get done just to get people to register up until the 13th. But then also absolutely pushing for everyone to request a mail-in ballot. And we're going to be coupling up with some other organizations who, after seeing the turnout and the response and the disparity of preparedness at the various polling stations, we're going to be meeting with some other organizations to try and do what we can to get the word out and to get some kind of follow-up on the absentee ballots that were requested. So people who have requested them, how they can go about following up on receiving their absentee ballots. It was an unbelievable day. You know that there was a lot of people who left. I mean, like I said, we went to 9 different polling stations, and out of the 9, I would say 2 of them didn't have, the shortest line was an hour long. And that was in one of the, nicer neighborhoods who were somewhat prepared. We literally, at the polling locations, were feeding and giving water to the polling station staff who didn't have masks. They didn't have water. They didn't have snacks. We were providing that to them as well. So not only were they not taking care of the voters, they weren't even taking care of the staff. There were a lot of people in line without mask. And I'm just glad that we even thought or even could get our hands on some masks to be able to hand those out, because they were in those long lines back to back to each other in close proximity for long periods of time. And, you know, putting themselves at risk just because they want to exercise the franchise, you know. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in Georgia.
Yeah, thank you, LaTanya. Thank you for your persistence and your dedication, and you know, bringing supplies to both the people waiting in line and the workers as well. Yeah, I think this is a clear example of why we're organizing now, making sure that people know about the absentee ballot options and how we can really get people mobilizing. So it sounds like for the strategy in Georgia for November is going to be about absentee ballots and making sure that people get them ahead of time. And anything else you want to add about what your strategy is you're looking forward towards November?
Just being really aggressive with people committing to vote. We're actually going to be getting some flyers made up of people committing to vote, just so that we can keep it on their mind and reminding them that, hey, you have to register by July 13th here in Georgia in order to even vote in November. So just to kind of stay in front of them consistently. And like I said, just do whatever we can to remind them, as well as figure out a way to stay in contact with the Secretary of State. We know that they can go online and see if they're registered to vote, but there's no way to see if they're that their absentee ballot has been mailed to them. So some kind of way we need to stay on top of the Secretary of State for that, because a lot of people in Georgia didn't receive their absentee ballots. Keisha Lance Bottom, the mayor of Atlanta, was one of them. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you would think that if you were going to make sure that anybody got their ballot, that it would be the mayor.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you for that, and looking forward to hearing more about your advocacy in Georgia for sure. So next we're going to go to Pennsylvania, and we have Teresa Sullivan and Michelle Kohler, who are going to tell us a little bit about what their case study in Pennsylvania was like. And Teresa and Michelle, do you mind introducing yourself and then telling us a little bit about what happened?
Sure. My name is Teresa Sullivan. I go by she and her pronouns. And I live in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. And I'm part of the Vote Positive Pennsylvania's core group here. I'm a long time advocate of getting people registered to vote in my own state, in my own city. So when this came as something to do part of PWN, I jumped right on it because we did this back and get out to vote in 2018. And it went very well. So as we move forward, this work continues needs to happen, regardless of what state that you live in, more so now because of all the issues that are on the table that will, with this administration, will take away simple things like our health care, is a battle all the time. I often say that in 2018, we fought very, very hard to keep our health care, but the fight is not over. Here we are again. So in our state of Pennsylvania, and last year, October the 31st, our Governor Wolf passed a bill called Act 77. That bill allowed for the first time for Pennsylvanians to cast their mail-in ballot without any kind of excuse. It was a fight. It's been something that we've been trying to get done, and it finally got passed into law in October 31st last year. So while we were doing the vote positive work here on the ground, we knew that we needed to educate our universe of voters about this mail-in ballot. As it was mentioned earlier, you know, that mail-in ballot is not something new, but it's new for a lot of people who never heard about it, right? Or knew that they could have access to it without having an excuse like we do for the absentee ballot here in Pennsylvania. You have to have a reason why. With the mail-in ballot, you do not need a reason why. It is an online application that you have to process yourself. A couple of the requirements are for you to be a registered voter. So one of the first things that we made sure of is that people are registered to vote. We host several platforms to do that. On Facebook Live, we did a couple of Facebook Live events talking about registering to vote, how to do that, sharing links to where to do that in Pennsylvania. We also did it in person. We actually had one of the voting machines brought to a location and to have people practice how to vote, because the new voting machines are something new for a lot of people too. So that's what we did as far as the mail-in ballot is concerned, and the things that we continue to do is to educate our community. We do and have ran into some changes here. We initially had our primary was supposed to be April the 28th. As we all know, COVID-19 put a halt to all that, and we had it shift to June the 2nd. And I'm gonna let Michelle talk a little bit about that on our primary.
Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, like Teresa said, mail-in or absentee ballot is not new in Pennsylvania, but the mail-in ballot that is available to everyone is. There's a lot of mistrust that we were hearing about on social media. There was like actually, it looked to me like big campaigns trying to shame people and scare people about mail-in ballots. And why do you need to do a mail-in ballot? You go to the grocery store, there's no bigger risk. Well, we know that there is a lot bigger risk, especially with, you know, what happened in Georgia. Pennsylvania was not so good either. A few issues, the absentee ballots did not get to people in time. They needed to hold up the counting of the election results. I don't know if they're still in. Our election date was June 2nd. June 9th, they were supposed to have the final results in. As far as I know, they are still not in. So they are still counting ballots, which is thankful. I'm thankful that they are, but we really got to get these issues worked out before the general election. One of our core members, Andrea, she was, she's part of a, oh shoot, I forget what the name of it is, a community organization that she goes to the polls, make sure everything runs right. No, it was not. They had combined 9 polling stations into one. The lines were ridiculous. There were not enough poll workers. There were not masks for the poll workers. There was not pretty much anything for people to keep themselves safe. No distancing between people. And Andrea felt very strongly, which I'm very thankful that we do have these organizations where we're really trying to help people to continue to vote, because this gets extremely frustrating. Like, imagine this is your first time voting and then you see all these things going on, and it's definitely purposeful. We do have better ways. We got to work on this. So this is kind of where we come in. One of the things that Teresa touched on was the Facebook Lives, which I think were very effective. We had not really had much experience with working with social media with our campaign to register voters, but I'm thankful for COVID-19 because we've had to like pick up technology like really fast, and it's amazing like how much we can do when we really set our minds to it, even though it's really scary, but we do get things done. And Latanya, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but I am so thankful that you were so persistent and to help people get to exercise their right to vote and just keep going. This is what we need to do. I think for like moving forward for the general election, we definitely want to start earlier, do more education about the mail-in ballots, make sure that we can continue to do it, because for a lot of people that are scared about that prospect, thinking that their votes are not going to be counted, we can do more education about that. I was scared myself. I was like, why would they do this right now in a presidential election year? I don't trust this. This just sounds fishy to me. But then when I did more research and went back, I realized it was about 10 years that we've been trying to do this. Mm-hmm. Finally, we got it passed. So this was amazing that we were able to do it prior to COVID-19, but of course we still have those kinks to work out. But I know a lot of other people are like me, and they're like, why this, why now, and how do I know it was counted? But there is a way when you go back to, I believe it's pavotes.gov.
Yeah, .gov.
You can track your ballot, which for me, it gave me peace of mind after I realized that is something that we can do. So we just need to continue to educate voters and make sure that people know where to report voter suppression and be on the lookout for it, and just keep doing what we're doing. We're getting people to turn out.
Yeah, and you know, one of the main things that I want to tell other states to be aware of and think that you can do in your own state is that because you have, if you're part of a Vote Positive campaign, is that you have a universe of people who are registered to vote in a database. You want to continue to build relationships with those people. You want to stay connected to those people, sending them like emails, alerts, calls to action when they come up from PWN. You know, making sure that they are involved in it that way, because they trust you, because they gave you your information to be in the universe. So by doing that with them, they will do that with their friends and their families, and the people they know, to build that universe of getting people to go actually do the mail-in ballot, right? Education goes a long way. And by you educating people in your universe of voters with your Vote Positive, they can educate those people close to them, right? Because the main goal is to educate people for mail-in ballot, but also get people to actually do it. We can talk about and educate all we want, but if we don't stay connected and build relationships with people to make sure that they actually get all the things they need to actually do it, there's so many barriers and voter suppressions that's going to be set up, not just for this primary that we just had, because we already seen how the polling places were chaos. And one thing that Brianna touched on that I'm totally in agreement with, $400 million is a kick in the bucket. It is a drop in the bucket to what we need. That $3.6 billion that the Herald bill has passed through the House, there could be a call to action in your state through your universe to have people actually call the senators, right, to do a hard push to make sure that gets passed, right? Because we don't do that, they don't think that we need it, right? They don't want to give it to us in the first place, right? So that's one thing that we can do going forward when we get closer to November's general election, right, is to build upon our universe and the education and do some call to action to make sure the things that we talked about here today actually happen. One thing I want to also say is that I did the hustle, where we called all it's an app that we have all our universe dropped in, and we do reminders of people like, hey, it's election day, did you vote? Here's where you can find out where your voting poll is at. You get a lot of responses, and you get responses from people like, yes, I do a mail-in ballot, no, I didn't. Where do I go to get my poll? I went, they was closed. A lot of that's still going to happen as we move forward to November. So we have to make sure that we're using all these tools that we have, such as hustle and reminders in our universe, and connecting with our folks to make sure that they are actually getting everything they need to go cast their vote. It
Yeah.
is so important right now in the middle of COVID-19. Want to make sure that people staying safe as well.
Thank you, Teresa. That's a great reminder that we're going to use all of our tools. We're going to organize together, and we're going to stay connected with our community. And so for specific things that advocates can do, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Ebony.
Thank you. And thank you to the team in Georgia. Thank you to the team in Pennsylvania for all of the hard work you're doing. Thank you to all of our teams that's around doing the great work that we need to be done. And for everybody else on this call, here are some things that you can do to make sure, so we can make sure in November that when we go to the polls, when our families, our friends, our communities go to the polls, they're voting in their best interest and they're getting the opportunity to vote. And I just said go to the polls. When I say go to the polls, I mean either they're getting that ballot into, they're mailing that ballot, or if necessary, going to the polls safely. Number one, know your vote by mail, absentee voter, and early voting laws. All you have to do is go to your local your local Board of Elections sites on the internet if you have access, and look that up. And you can learn about your vote by mail, absentee voter, and early voter laws. So first step, learn that. Second, advocate to improve them. If there is a way that you can advocate to improve those laws, whatever they are in your state. I'm in Texas. They don't want us to vote. No. So I am always saying, we need vote by mail. We need vote by mail. And as Nana said earlier, the decisions are changing minute to minute to minute out here. People are fighting though. 3, talk to election officials about improving access, including like drop-off times, drop-off locations where people can drop their ballots off if they need to, and extending the time for them to do it. These are all things that we can do. These are all things that we can educate people around us to do as well. 4, look into and advocate for harm reduction options. What that means is options that that helps us make sure we can get people to the we can get our ballots in without having to go to the polls, or get to the polls without putting harm on ourselves. So expanding early voting in-person times and dates means less people at the polls. If we get if we expand our early voting hours, if we make sure people know, okay, you can start voting today, or early voting opened up, and people start going earlier, it lessens the people who are if they have to go to the polls, it lessens the people who are at the polls on election day. So let's try to make sure we know our early voting days, and make sure we know, are letting people know that they can go out and vote on those days. A lot of organizations, a lot of people have actual get out to vote pushes for early voting. So if you have that in your state, that's something you can really do. Next slide. Educate voters about their vote by mail options and encourage them to re-register to vote by mail. Really quickly, I'm gonna say there is very bad information going around in a meme on social media about vote by mail. They're saying like, it's people who don't really know what they're saying, but they're like, if you can stand in line to buy something, to buy some shoes or to buy some jewelry, you can stand in line to vote. But that's because they don't understand what's happening. So we need you guys to be out there gently educating people when they are spreading misinformation. Do not attack anybody, because that's not how necessarily we get we get a chance to educate. But we can just gently let them know that we do want more states. We want everybody to be able to vote by mail, because it creates an opportunity for everybody to vote and not have all of these voter suppression tactics. So educate the people in your community, in your network, in your family, in your friend network. That's a start. Run a vote by mail drive or advocacy campaign. Have a way for your clients, constituents, community members to register to vote by mail. I'm gonna say that again. Have a way for your clients, constituents, community members to register to vote by mail. This is a community activity. People who see clients can do this. People who have constituencies can do this. This is really important, and we need to make sure people have this option. If you don't have vote by mail, talk to your election folks about it. It's not too late to make changes before November. Remember, we have a pandemic, so it's actually a very valid reason why states need this vote by mail. Give away stamps for mail-in ballots. So if people have mail-in ballots and they just offer, even I feel like even if they may be able to get it, the easier it makes the easier you can make something to mail, the better. If somebody give me an envelope and give me a stamp and say, I'm gonna take this to you, it makes it easier for me. I am horrible at mailing things. So stamps and say, I'll deliver that for you, it makes it way easier for me. So giving away stamps and collect and drop off ballots if allowable in your state. Make sure, don't break any laws. Make sure you're doing what's allowable in your state. And then post the things that you're doing on social media, the things that you can post on social media, the things that's appropriate. Like, don't post anybody, at least they give you permission, but the things that you're doing, post on social media. You can do some of this education on social media. Believe it or not, just making a post about what people can do and what people can't do in your state helps. Just making a post about how people can advocate. You can just make a post and say, call this number and tell them you want vote by mail options. All of those things you can do on social media to try to advocate for vote by mail. And if you are posting on social media, of course, PWN would love if you use the hashtag PWN votes by mail, because that helps us see what everybody's doing. When we go to the hashtag, we can see what you all are doing in your communities. So we hope that you could do some of this organizing with us. I want to see it. It always excites me when I see people giving people good information, because for so long we haven't known so many things. And right now they're really trying to suppress our vote, and we're not having it. We're going to fight back. Let's fight back, y'all. Let's make sure that we can vote. Let's make sure that we can get our ballots to vote by mail. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ebony. Really appreciate the call to action. And indeed, we are here together. We're going to learn lessons from the primaries and from our great folks who shared today. Thank you again, LaTanya and Michelle and Teresa, for giving us a little snapshot of what actions you did and what is possible, and also why it is so very important. We are just about at the end of our time. If there is one or two people who want to raise your hand in the chat box and talk about what steps you can take to expand the vote in your community, we'd love to hear from you. Just as we're getting ready to conclude. All right. And while we're waiting to see if anyone would like to, really just want to go ahead and share these additional resources with you. This is the Making of the Vote by Mail Work for You. It's a great report, as well as this nonprofit vote is a good resource when you're looking at what is specific to your state. And then in conclusion, just wanted to say that, you know, again, as we look towards November, it is important to learn the lessons that we have seen, that we want to make sure that all of our 1.1 million people living with HIV who are able to vote feel empowered to vote and are able to vote, and that we also reach out broader into our communities to ensure that this ripple effect goes out, and that we are ensuring that we can vote safely, that we are educated, and that our vote matters. So want to just give both Nana and Brianna an opportunity if you have a last thought that you want to share with people.
Sure. I want to really thank everybody for participating on this webinar and for your commitment to making sure that our communities are counted. This is critically important. I want to really deeply thank LaTanya and the Georgia team, and Michelle and Teresa and the folks on the Pennsylvania team, and all of the other organizers on here that are, you know, busting their butts every day to make sure that our community is really well represented in the political landscape. This is not insignificant work. And there's a common narrative, you know, that like people from communities that have been historically marginalized and where the vote has been suppressed, that we're like apathetic, we don't care, like Black and brown folks like didn't bother to show up at the polls. And I just want to say that's bullshit. I hope you heard today how much bullshit that is. Like, folks stood in line for hours and hours and hours in a pandemic to make sure their votes were counted. Folks are telling you that they are volunteering and organizing and literally putting their own lives and their own health on the line to make sure that our people's voices are represented and counted. And it is incumbent upon any of us who have the ability to do so, to do everything we can to break down these barriers and make sure that our community has a powerful voice come November. So thank you all so much. And special thank you to all of our amazing panelists and organizers of this webinar today.
Barb, you're talking and we cannot hear anything you're saying. You're on mute.
Yes, Brianna, did you want to add anything before we go ahead and conclude?
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, thank all of the presenters and the organizers and the mobilizers. Thank you again, LaTanya, Michelle, and Teresa, for bringing real world situations and real examples so we can learn and build those into our structures moving forward. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Brianna and Nana. Their emails are here. And otherwise, we will go ahead and share the slides and the recording with everybody tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again for your interest in making sure that our vote and our voice is heard. PWN votes! Woohoo! By mail!
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, Barb.
Good night.
Ebony, Teresa, Michelle, LaTanya.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank